Okay, guys, it's about, what is it? 2:30, which means it's time for one of our highlight sessions of the day, which is a half an hour talk, lecture, polemic, whatever we're going to get from broadcaster, author, essayist, and critic Jonathan Meades. You've read his stuff, you've watched him on telly. Here he is live to talk about planners, regeneration, architecture, and the construction industry. Jonathan Meades, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me, because I can hardly hear myself, but that apparently goes with this podium. In 2007, a production assistant who had worked on quite a few of my telly shows called me up. She didn't email, she didn't text, she called me. And this was to announce that she was really sorry, but she couldn't work on the programs I was then preparing because she was getting married. And so I made the usual sympathetic noises, congratulations, condolences, etc., and said who she's getting married to, and she said an architect. So I said, well, what kind of architect? Tell me about him. Well, he had worked with some of the big dogs in Glasgow, Powell, Winalot, Pedigree. But now he was going out on his own with his great mate, and they were going to start from scratch, a small practice, as so many people have done in the past. So I said, well, what kind of work are they going to do? And she said, they're really into sustainable development. Well, I tried to dissemble the kind of wince that I made, and also tried to dissemble my incredulity, because she might as well have said, well, I'm going to marry the kind of architect that breathes air to keep alive. The architect who is not, even then, 9 years ago, even then the architect who was not an enthusiast for sustainability was as rare as the disc jockey who is not an enthusiast for small children. Even then, 9 years ago, sustainability was, like vibrant diversity, cliche at best, a lie at worst. It was a shibboleth of every arm of the construction industry. It was routinely spouted out, it was thoughtlessly spouted out by architects in black, by developers in bespoke suits, by hoddies in jeans, which revealed that deliciously coiffed cleft, which was known as builder's bum, but then became known as an urban regenerator's bum. In France, incidentally, it's called the smile of the plumber. Sustainability was so ubiquitous that it had become absolutely meaningless, sustaintastic, sustainabulous. Even the demolition industry had got in on the act and had referred to its practices of knocking down buildings as sustainability. Now, has it ever been more than a word, or a couple of words which signify nothing, but which are nonetheless absolutely obligatory, obligatory badges of belonging? They have to be spoken to show that you're part of the tribe. It's like a salute or Mason's handshake. Now, if they are to regain any meaning, sustainability and sustainable development must be redefined. But hold on, before we think of redefinition, we should ask, do we actually need sustainable development? Is it essential to society? The very idea is based on the premise that what we create, streets, buildings, bridges, infrastructure, power stations, etc., should be made with the long term in mind. It should be made for the sake of our so far non-existent great-grandchildren and for the sake of the Earth, which does exist for the moment. Though because the Earth is inanimate, it has no idea that we are its friends. And it doesn't reciprocate that friendship. Far from it. Tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes. The sustainable should be adaptable to the needs of future milia and future cultures. But these are unknown. They're unimaginable. All one can say is that such needs are unforeseeable. And it's only by chance that certain structures remain utile and transformable for purposes undreamt of when they were built. And we cannot second guess the fate of what we build. The notion of timelessness is attractive, certainly, but it's not a quality that we can or ought to aim for. Everything reveals its date. A neo-Georgian building of 1900 is very different from a 1950 neo-Georgian building. And we don't know what will, so to speak, live beyond its normal span. Gauging the future, whether by dicey scientific analysis or by the rational sorcery of haruspication, which is divination by entrails, it's all too obviously an oblique way of scrutinizing the present. Half a century ago, in the era of the man who I consider to be the greatest of all post-war prime ministers, Harold Wilson, we linked what he called the white heat of the scientific revolution to the germ of a future when we would live on pills, we would wear nylon tunics, we would ride maglev monorails, we would fly in jet-powered air scooters, and we would live in mobile domes and holiday in space colonies. Robots would do our jobs, and our lives would be fun and more fun. We would all do this and much more besides. But we don't. The future, the conditional future, the future that wasn't to be, was characterized by bigness, by big tech. Its manifestations were out of scale with the old country it briefly inhabited between the late 1950s and the oil crises of the mid-1970s. There was a palpable collective excitement at the way the world, or this country, changed in those 15 or so years. For those of us who can remember that period, what has followed has been perpetually anticlimactic, and slight. Everything, nearly everything, and I accept bloated cars like Chelsea tractors and bloated telescreens, everything has got smaller. A computer which once needed a bungalow to house it was infinitely less powerful than the instrument that you lose every day at the bottom of your handbag, which is a private space. And once you've located it, it's sutured to your jaw like a prosthesis. I should talk about this, yeah? Which of course is what it is. And that somehow symbolizes our retreat into privacy. The virtual is nothing but a compact between use and a piece of kit. Anti-social media and sit on my Facebook a means of avoiding the actual. The paradox is that they turn crowds, which have a collective momentum, into gatherings of atomized individuals, hermits surrounded by numberless other hermits. Our aspirations have diminished. The optimism which pervaded everything, not despite, but because of the Cold War, has diminished. We were living on borrowed time before we were incinerated by mutually assured destruction, MAD. In fact, that reciprocal threat made the world, this is a cliche, a safer place than it is today. And indeed, the grandiose building programs of the Soviet Union and its satellites, and on the other hand, those of the West, so accurately mirrored each other that one might talk of MAC, mutually agreed construction. Both sides of the Iron Curtain built stylistically similar buildings, both built for the moment. Despite their futurism, they didn't build with some notional future in mind, some future over the horizon. They were building the future which had already arrived. Megastructures, cooling towers, motorway junctions, transmitter masts, listening stations. Besides, how do you build for an unrevealed, unknowable future in which much of the world wants to return to a heavily tooled up Middle Ages and execute dissenters? How do you build for a future world in which the chasm between the few rich and the many poor grows ever wider? How do you build for a world in which robots do not do our jobs, but where many of us are treated like robots? Short contracts, work experience, or skivvying, as it used to be called, and interns. And those who aren't treated like robots have no job. How do you build for the future when you're not soothsayers? You don't. The great poet A.E. Housman is the man to follow here, I think. He wrote, "I am a sereniac, or egotistic hedonist, and regard the pleasure of the moment as the only possible motive of action." I'm not sure that pleasure is the apt word. Maybe one should talk of the needs of the moment. This isn't defeatism, but regrettable realism. We ought perhaps always to behave as though we were waging the Cold War, and that tomorrow we may die at a mad zealot's push of a button. But we don't. Now, lest this appear willfully contrarian, we should consider what buildings survive and those which don't. The doctrine of sustainability is born out of guilt or expiation or penitence or absolution, one of those things. It's linked to the preoccupation with pointless self-congratulatory apology. We apologize for the slave trade, though no matter how well meant the apology, it is not going to bring back to life those who died, those who were in effect murdered. Sorry. We apologize for the opium wars, though it's a bit late to send its addicted victims to the Priory. Sorry. We apologize for executing deserters, mere cannon fodder. Sorry, sorry, sorry. Even though there are no absolutes, we judge the past by the mores of the present. The present, to a certain mindset, is necessarily superior to the past. In the past, our predecessors were, by our standards, criminal, cruel, grossly negligent. They burnt the wrong fuels, selfishly built for themselves, carelessly polluted watercourses, unknowingly spread diseases, poisoned the atmosphere, and probably deluded themselves that they would witness the rapture before the stones and bricks, clunch and flint, cob and timber that they used in their structure crumbled and rotted. And yet so much survives. so much has proved to be sustainable. That word was not, of course, coined. The idea it represents was far in the future. It was largely unknowingly sustainable. The word wasn't used in this context till the 1980s. Aptly, for that was the decade when greenness, a Nazi guiding principle founded in Blood and Soil, went mainstream, or rather green tokenism went mainstream. This was when humankind started palling up with the earth and cycling and recycling and adopting an ideological rather than pragmatic attitude towards energy, mining, quarrying, road traffic, nuclear power, and eating meat. Adopting an attitude need not be more than that, right on in what I say rather than right on in what I do, preaching, not practicing, which was often the case. All this pious self-righteousness ultimately derived from hippiedom, from its muddier, more bucolic, more politically engaged, let's live in a yurt side, just as piratical neoliberalism or revived Manchester liberalism, which was governmentally sanctioned after Mrs. Thatcher's advent in 1979, derived from hippiedom's urban, black economic, dope-dealing, patchouli and beads side. The two melded into a gruesome authoritarian ethos of institutionalized anti-elitism, which was, as the former MP George Walden has pointed out, about as elitist as you can get. When the ineffable Tony Blair, a sometime Prime Minister so far unconvicted of war crimes, announced that he was fighting the establishment, you know that the world has been turned upside down, or that he is a self-deluding liar. If anyone believed in sustainability as a guiding rule rather than as a word without meaning to throw into every conversation, every presentation, every conference such as this, they might look at what survives generation upon generation, epoch upon epoch, at what benefits from a sort of architectural natural selection, at what possesses survival devices. Those devices are mostly determined according to use. There was, and probably always will be, a hierarchy of use. Till the recent past, places of worship were the best built and best repaired because they were valued above the transitory lives of those who built them. I grew up in Salisbury, which has a cathedral which is, you must know, is one of the glories of England, perhaps one of the glories of Europe. It's the only great cathedral in Europe, with the exception of its near contemporary at Amiens, that was built in one campaign over 50 years. It's resultantly stylistically consistent. And it's remained consistent because the quarries which supplied the stone are not worked out. They've provided stone for the cathedral for over 8 centuries, and it has been in a state of perpetual repair and restoration. The famous West Front is mainly of the 19th century, though the cathedral's PR mendaciously and hilariously claims it is medieval. It's not sustainable, rather it has been sustained. This great building is maintained by masons and stone carvers who are pasticheurs. It's an imitation of itself, a fake if you like. Last year I watched as a drone-mounted camera, expertly controlled by a technician sprawled in a deck chair, scrutinize the heights of the spire to determine which blocks of stone needed replacing. Those blocks will be cut to the millimetre in the mason's yard beside the cloisters, where lorries deliver the raw material. Lorries. There were no lorries in the 13th century, and few carts could bear the weight of the massive boulders that had been quarried. Having decided the site of the cathedral caused a problem. The immediately local building material was chalk in various formulations such as cob and pug, primitive concrete strengthened sometimes by straw and far from durable. The nearest high-quality building material, fine-grained oolitic limestone, was to be found at Chilmark, which is 12 miles west by lorry or cart and rather further by river, which, for want of anything else, was to be the primary means of transport. The river at Chilmark is the Nadder, which takes its name from its resemblance to an adder. It curls like that. It's both a tributary of the Wylye, which is in turn, it is a tributary of the Wylye, which is in turn a tributary of the Hampshire Avon. Navigations, diversions, and cuts had to be made to all these streams. The legacy of the canalization is apparent today. There are straits which are unknown in nature. In places, the rivers had to be widened. Now, if we consider the extent and ramifications of this preparatory work, even pre-preparatory work, we're bound to imagine the disruption and inconvenience and sheer chaos that the construction of the building caused. Land was appropriated, clearances were affected, farms had to be abandoned, grazing was lost, spoil tips appeared in fields. Plus ça change and all that. 900 years on and building, the act of building, the process, the inevitably spendthrift process, remains unique in its appetite for energy, its power to disrupt, and its dizzying cost. Making a building is not akin to making a chair in a workshop, or a car in a factory, or a curry in a kitchen, or a painting in a studio. It's not a comparable process, because no matter how small it may be, the building itself is the workshop, the factory, the kitchen, the studio. Central London is all these, a perpetual building site. Scaffolding, glass, breeze blocks, pipes have to be delivered to awkward sites in unsuitable lorries by loutish, negligent drivers who are lost and careless of cyclists. Yes, we should all cycle, but not before the architects who advocate cycling devise ways of making it safe. How our perpetual building site impinges on the quality of life is evident to everyone who lives or works here, cyclist or not. Central London's developments tend not to be small, and the inevitable consequences are in direct proportion to size. The larger the project, Crossrail say, the greater, the more various, and the longer lasting the embuggerances, as they say in the army. Crossrail will, of course, in theory at least, be of public benefit. That is not the case with the thousands of so-called icons, landmark buildings, boasts, and penile substitutes, and thousands of square feet of offices which are bought off plan and unoccupied. The only reason I can see for favouring Brexit is that sterling may plummet, highly respected Ukrainian businessmen and Azerbaijani philanthropists with diplomatic immunity, humble Virgin Islanders and gentlemen from Magnitogorsk who own all the water in the Urals will look on impotently as their property portfolios become worthless and their grotesque neo-modern apartments that they have never visited are compulsorily purchased and let to the homeless. You know, the people without name, the people who choose to camp in shop doorways or by heat extractors, rehearsing no doubt for an outward bound adventure. And pigs might fly. I don't mean that sterling is so strong that it's immune to the unreadable vagaries of the currency market. I do mean that no English government would dare carry out compulsory purchases. The very idea is outside the current consensus. there is, as ever, cross-party agreement on the majority of issues, a sort of socio-political zeitgeist. There has, in this country for many years, existed a hesitancy about dirigism, bordering on fear. There is significantly not a precisely accurate English word for this sort of managerial interventionism, which is mistrusted as authoritarian, as maybe fascist, as French, especially the France of de Gaulle, who was regarded by both Churchill and Roosevelt as a fascist and rather proved it when he gained power. The most obvious expression of dirigism is nationalization, which may be a dirty word in political circles, but is something devoutly to be wished for by Britain's ripped-off commuters and persons who cannot afford the affordable, because what is affordable to the empathy-free wallpaper heir George Osborne is not affordable to the guy who hangs the wallpaper in the abode of those to whom the affordable is something for the little people. During the period between the end of the war in 1945 and Thatcher's Machtergreifung, her seizure of power in 1979, which was down to a catastrophic misjudgment, remember, by James Callaghan about when to call an election, both parties held office for 17 years each. Both major parties supported the NHS, nationalised industries, and the construction of social housing. To have done otherwise was absolutely unthinkable. Thatcher famously thought the absolutely unthinkable. Actually, it was not unthinkable. It had already been thought by Pierre Poujade, but that was in France. Poujade was a small shopkeeper in a small town near Toulouse, who became a populist demagogue championing small businesses and small businessmen, nationalist, intolerant, aggrieved. This was in the years before de Gaulle's coup d'etat in 1958. Poujade recognized and exploited the conservatism of a class that felt habitually overlooked. Sauve qui peut, each for his own, was a ready-made slogan. Dennis Healey was on the money when he described Thatcher as a piggy bank Poujadiste. The difference was that Poujade was never more than a loud peripheral figure. That is not an accusation that can be levelled at Margaret Thatcher. Now, you may think it cliched and anachronistic to dwell on someone who came to power 37 years ago and was stabbed in the front over 26 years ago. But Thatcher's unthinkable thoughts have pervaded British governance for a generation and a half. Just as there was a welfarist Commonwealth consensus for 30 years, so has there been Samuel Smiles, self-help, devil take the hindmost, Tebbit-initiated get on your bike consensus for the subsequent 30 years. An officially sanctioned greed consensus. One thinks of Peter Mandelson's observation that New Labour was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. That's what I call cross-party consensus. It has infected not just government, but the entire nation. The bottom line is indeed the bottom line. It was not Thatcher's intention that England should become a vicious, mean-spirited, wealth-obsessed, hyper-capitalist country, but she was instrumental in making it so. Unintended consequences and all that. Blairism was merely Thatcherism with a hideous grin of sincerity. And sincerity is an abominable quality, a satanic mask. Hitler was sincere, Pol Pot was sincere, Beria was sincere. Better, far better to believe in nothing. Yeats, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. But how do those without conviction overturn that passionate intensity? A passionate intensity which in the case of the construction industry is inward-looking. Its task is to build, that's its very reason for existence, to procreate, to make. That's what it does. Asking questions about the validity and purpose of what it builds is not part of its remit, whatever its PRs may say. Never believe a PR. Some of my best friends are PRs, charming people. But maybe the construction industry should be asking itself questions at last. The process of building and the results of that process touch us all, not just people in that labyrinthine trade. But it touches workers in those buildings. It touches the people who live in them. It touches the people who pass them by every day. One hears whispers of something called ethical construction. That doesn't merely mean declining to build torture chambers for the dictators of Otherstan, Kalashnistan, Uzistan, Boristan, and Tonistan. It means have nothing to do with those states. It means not using the excuse of shareholders and employees. It means not littering London with £20 million apartments that will remain empty, vacuous fortresses in our midst, guarded by vigilante apes with corrugated necks and earpieces who are a law unto themselves. Is there any water? Excuse me. Thank you. Sorry about that. Class clearances, throat clearances. Yeah, vigilante apes with corrugated necks and earpieces who are law unto themselves. It means acquiring a sense of responsibility that refuses to privatize public land in the name of security. It means opposing gated communities, the very word is indecent, communities which are to the 21st century what enclosures were to the 18th century. We're seeing the rich pushing out the poor, class clearances, in Birmingham and Manchester as well as in London. We have in this century abandoned the American example where inner city is synonymous with deprivation and crime, and we have, with ever-increasing rapidity and ever-increasing thoughtlessness, adopted the French model, where social unrest is confined to outside the ring road, out of sight and unheeded, save during the traditional car-burning season in early winter. It is neither ethical nor responsible to erect buildings which are highly likely to endure for only 30 years. Postmodernism, the predominant idiom from the mid-70s till the mid-90s, has gone through a long period of being unfashionable. That is no more reason to destroy buildings in that style than it was to destroy high Victorian houses and brutalist car parks. Everything comes back into fashion after a time, and just about all buildings are adaptable. The more noise is made about sustainability, the shorter the lifespan of buildings made by the very people who preach sustainability have become. Are they hypocrites or merely inescapable of joined-up thinking? What is regarded as a moral shift, or if that sounds as though I'm heading in a spiritual direction, then the sort of cultural shock that was known a generation ago as a sea change, a move towards the kind of pragmatism that would not give a moment's consideration to populist, frivolous, bread and circus projects such as the half-witted Garden Bridge or Manchester's £110 million arts centre, and the 260 further excrescences in bling, 260, which the thankfully outgoing mayor will sign off, ignoring the proper procedures. He will do this in response to a so-called planning push. Rather, we need to establish a hierarchy not of aesthetic need, but of social need. There's nothing particularly extreme about such a proposal. It is rather the situation in which we find ourselves that is extreme, in comparison anyway with our more socially receptive European neighbours. But we're so inured to it, we hardly notice it. A generation has grown up which has never known any god but mammon, any ideology but that of the market, the merciless, rapacious market which favours the bully and casts aside the weak. Such an ethos is bound to have a coarsening effect, not least on the market itself, which becomes more and more corporate. And this is the inevitable result of deregulation. The big swallows the small. The quality of life and the extent of retail choice in Spain and Morocco is enhanced by the simple means of regulating the hours that supermarkets can open. This has little to do with building, but a lot to do with a willingness to intervene on the side of the people. You might say a duty to intervene. It is that obligation which has in this country to be relearnt, or given how long it has been in abeyance, learnt from scratch. Along with such strategies is fiscal brakes for reuse and conversion, aesthetic control, encouragement to build on top of current building, stricter planning, and the statutory employment of architects. According to the most recent figures available, only a quarter of current construction projects in the UK are designed by architects, a state which I find rather shocking. We don't allow unqualified quacks to perform surgery on us. We don't employ shyster solicitors if we can help it. This is unquestionably the reason why English housing, at least, often in the shape of the ineffable executive home with 3 garages and a vaguely neo-Victorian demeanour, lags so far behind the housing of the Netherlands and Spain. Volume builders appear to assume that the British populace shares its banal taste. The practice of creating an appetite for the fresh and unknown equally needs to be revived. Taste can be created. The market, that word again, can be made rather than torpidly responded to. Lead rather than follow. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a tour de force from Jonathan, as we, I'm sure, expected. We haven't got hours, but we have got minutes, and those minutes should be taken up with having a conversation with Jonathan. Who would like to ask a question? This gentleman here in blue, if we can get a microphone to him. Well, while that microphone's coming, Jonathan, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Just following in from your idea of sort of benign dictatorship, if there was a planning czar, somebody who had an overall view on planning in this country, and he could set the parameters for what got built and what got demolished, and you happen to have that job, what would you do with it?
I think what's needed, but I'd be a most unsuitable person to do anything like that, but what is needed is a sensitivity to each particular place, not a coarse directive which says, yes, you can build here, you can build high, there you can build low, there you can build stepped and staggered or something. I think it requires a much greater knowledge of what is there already. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, a Southwark planner looked at the building I lived in Bermondsey Street and said it's a really nice Victorian warehouse. It was about 5 years old. And I think one has got a problem with people who's
clueless.
who are clueless and don't really seem to mind that they're clueless.
Yeah. Ignorance is not a good thing when it comes to building.
No, ignorance is not really a very good thing
No.
in any circumstance, I suspect.
No. So,
If I could, Jeff Beacon, Pollution Tax Association. If I could answer the chair's question and ask for a comment, what I would do is I wouldn't build any more tall buildings. Climate change more or less forbids that. We can't go on building things like the ones behind you because they've got enormous embodied carbon. And I would recognise that the planning system steals from the poor to give to the rich, and that we could, with something like plot land development like they had in the 20s and 30s, allocate £500, £1,000 worth of land and say to people, put your legal and general kit home on it and you've got a really cheap house. Or if you want to start home, you can start at something like 15,000. We need to cool the housing market incredibly, and that is a bit laissez-faire, I will admit. But at the moment we've got laissez-faire that is a corrupt laissez-faire. Adam Smith would be turning in his grave.
No, I agree. I'm all for plot lands. I'm all for Walter Siegel. I'm all for containers. I mean, in Rotterdam Harbour, there is a container city, and it works very well. There seem to be inhibitions here about using containers for people to live in. The ones at Leamouth, which are very close, which are done, I forget, about 15 years ago, they're used as studios and arts offices, but no one seems to be allowed to live in them. I don't see why not. We could also do what happens in Rome, is you build on top of other buildings. I mean, you don't build on top of kind of precious things by Bernini or Coppede, but there are a lot of ordinary buildings which are not going to be destroyed by having a couple of extra stories put on them. And one can do this all over London. There isn't a proper register of unoccupied buildings in London. That needs to be created and it needs to be acted upon. But laissez-faire has become a kind of, as you're right, corrupt laissez-faire has become sort of ideologically okay. And there has to be a shift. There will be a shift. I mean, no one could see Thatcher coming. I mean, you know, she's just known for doing school children a great favour and taking away that disgusting milk.
Another question for Jonathan. Gentleman there, quicker than me, thank you.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the construction that's going on around the edge of Cambridge at the moment. But it seems as though the University of Cambridge have decided that all housing on the land that they own has got to look very much like halls of residence. And that's obviously an example of one institution having a tremendous influence over the housing for the working population of the city. Have you any comments on that?
What does a hall of residence look like? I mean, there are countless different kinds of halls of residence.
I mean, the actual community that students live in. Obviously, Cambridge is a very high-tech city, and so it's being built for. It's really being built for students who migrate out of university and then settle down, and that's obviously, as far as the cost goes, that obviously mitigates against the indigenous population or the local population, but also it is actually creating a sort of a mono society.
But all places which start from scratch do necessarily create a kind of mono society. I mean, if you look at Letchworth, with very sort of freaky sort of place for first, generation and a half of its existence, and Welwyn, which came 15 years later, was very odd, ingrown place, and the first provincial town actually to develop a serious heroin habit, presumably because of, stultifying boredom at looking at neo-Georgian houses. But to answer your question, I don't know. I've only seen these from going past. The places out towards Royston you're talking about, yeah?
I remember your program on East Anglia that you did some years back, and as I live there, I wonder if you could say sorry for that.
I have nothing to apologise for at all, anything. I thought it was reasonably fond.
Jonathan, I have a question. It's come up time and time again during the course of today, which is the parlous situation, disgraceful situation, that architects are not involved with a lot of buildings, the creation of a lot of buildings, the planning of a lot of buildings, the execution of a lot of buildings. How on earth did this come about?
I have no idea. It's again because there is no sort of statutory protection for architects and no obligation on anyone building anything to use an architect. I mean, this is not the case in, certainly not the case in the Netherlands.
No, it's not.
Which I think at the moment has the finest architecture in Europe. Interestingly, an architect I know who works out of Groningen in the north of the Netherlands loves working in Belgium because no one regulates him. Whereas when he's working in his home country, every step is scrutinized. And there is great stuff in Belgium up to the 1950s, but since then there has been a rather sad decline. Why this should happen, I don't know. It's because there is a resistance, a kind of very deep embedded resistance to any kind of authoritarianism in this country, or that we pretend that there is. I mean, there's all sorts of authoritarianism, but we dissemble, we pretend that we don't like that sort of thing, and it's not British.
So your theory is that it should be put on society. There should be some sort of system whereby there is an authoritative take on what the architectural standards and aesthetics of the day will be, and that will be imposed.
Yes, and that existed during the 35 years after the war. There was this thing called aesthetic control, and
run by which department?
DOE. And Mr. Heseltine, as he then was, abolished aesthetic control within months of Mrs. Thatcher coming to power.
Because?
Because it was against a free-for-all. It inhibited what the people want to do, whatever that is, whatever that means. But it was there was no other reason for it. But I mean, what one had seen in the years up to that, I mean, it's slightly understandable because modernism had really come to an end. There was some pretty ropey stuff around, and
it became a cliche.
It was thought that by doing this, you'd kind of get a greater diversity of stylistic diversity, greater diversity of settlements which would be set up. It didn't really seem to actually make that much difference in the end, because it probably didn't get down as far as planners in local authorities.
What a treat it is to have Jonathan Meades here with us this afternoon. Could you give him a very warm round of applause, please?
Thank you very much.
Jonathan, you were great. Thank you.